For week 3, we are going to be looking at Ashanti and the Gold Coast. Ashanti was the most important political state on the Gold Coast in the 18th and 19th century. And of course, the Gold Coast today is the country that's known as Ghana. Ashanti came into being in about 1700 as a major state in the interior of the Gold Coast. It was a state that would subsequently, in the next couple of decades after 1700, conquer most of the territory of what is now modern Ghana. Ethnically, Ashanti by origin was an Akan state. That is, the ethnicity was recognized as Akan. The language of the Akan is Twi, and Ashanti was one of the political states. There were about a dozen of them that were Akan, at least in their original manifestations. Ashanti eventually conquered much of the territory to its north, which was not an Akan ethnic region, and in fact included many other ethnic groups, and so that the actual state at its height was a multicultural state that had a significant Muslim population in the north. We're going to see that Muslim population in the readings for this week in reference to Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, who we'll be discussing through chatting in particular, but which there will be some introduction to in other formats, such as on the forum. So Ashanti and the Gold Coast is the subject of today's talk. And as the Gold Coast, the name suggests, it's an area in Africa where there was a considerable amount of gold, which you see here on the opening page, gold weights. These are weights that are with beautiful little designs that are made out of gold, and this was the way wealth was stored and the way wealth was measured in Ashanti and in neighboring states. So that Ashanti was a major producer of gold, which is where the name comes from. Here's a map of modern Ghana showing Ashanti in the middle there. Ashanti actually conquered everything in this map except the upper west part of the country. The area from Ashanti southward is all in the Akan region. This is what the area looks like. It's forested, and so therefore it's quite different from the savanna states to the north and other parts of West Africa. The other major commodity that was produced in Ashanti, besides gold, was kola nuts, which you see here in the upper right-hand corner. Kola is a nut that comes from a tree that grows in the forest in certain parts of West Africa, is chewed because it contains a lot of caffeine. It's actually, cola is also the inspiration for the various cola drinks that were developed at the end of the 19th century. But in Africa, cola was usually just consumed by chewing on it. And as you can see, this is a particular variety of cola. They're both whitish and pinkish in color. They easily split into half along the seam that you see on the nut. And because each nut contains so much caffeine, they usually are shared. People share these nuts, so they often have a very social significance. They have, to some extent, a religious significance, in that cola was consumed extensively by Muslims, and Muslims were prohibited from drinking alcoholic beverages or taking other types of stimulants, but not cola, and indeed not coffee uh, and some things. But cola was one thing that was allowed. And what you see here on the left is the market town of Salaga, which was a Muslim town in the northern part of Ashanti, which was the major market for the sale of cola to the north. Most of the cola that Ashanti grew was destined for the interior of West Africa, not to Europe or overseas. And you see here again a broader map that shows the links between Kumasi, the capital of Ashanti in the 18th century, the location of the three most important gold fields in West Africa, the Akan gold fields, the Bure and Bambouk. And Bure and Bambouk are on the Senegal River Valley. The Akan gold is found throughout the forest regions and the many creeks and streams that are in Ashanti. Another map showing the selected towns in West Africa in the 19th century, again to give you a sense of where Kumasi and Ashanti was located in terms of the other parts of West Africa. One of the features of West Africa in this time, which is not usually recognized, is the extent to which people actually lived in towns rather than in villages or in the countryside. And this only shows you a very small number of the towns, but nonetheless does give you some sense of how urban the region was. And this is a drawing of the capital city of Kumasi. The palace is on the right, the upper right-hand corner, and one of the relief from one of the columns is below on the lower right. You see another gold weight on the lower left, and you see a drawing of the city of Kumasi above it. Now, symbolically, the Ashanti state was built around the idea that a golden stool pictured here on its side had come down from heaven, and that is claimed to be the origins of the state, and that this happened in about 1701. And so this regalia, rather than a throne as in the kingdoms in Europe, the kings here sat on these stools. Often they were wooden stools, but in the case of Ashanti, there was the golden stool. And here you see one of the kings, the Ashantahene, sitting on his throne, his golden stool, and surrounded by his court, many of whom have instruments and artifacts that are made out of gold. One of the features of the government of Ashanti was that no one ever was allowed to speak directly with the Ashantahene, the king. They had to speak through an interpreter or a linguist or a spokesman who stood right next to the Ashantahene. And of course, the Ashantahene could hear everything, but you had to speak to the linguist, and then the linguist would then turn and repeat exactly what had just been said to the Ashantahene. This was the court etiquette. This was the staff of office of the linguist, which of course is made of gold. You see other staffs of office here with other officials of the state, each one of them having his own distinct golden staff. In this photo, what you see is a member of the elite who's wearing various golden uh, items, a wristband on his right arm, which is made out of gold. You see on his left arm, you see various charms, actually, that have Quranic verses written inside them. He's holding the tail of a horse, which is used to swat flies. And the most important is the kente cloth, the cloth that is made locally, narrow strips of cloth here woven into a beautiful pattern. Other examples of kente cloth, and one distinct feature of kente cloth is that every piece of cloth is made with a particular design, and each design has its own name. Hence, the one here, the actual name in Twi, when translated, means it has not happened before. I can't read the other one. Here's a contemporary map from the 18th century that shows Ashanti and the various other states and polities around Ashanti, all of which to the west of Dahomey were conquered by Ashanti. Another feature of the Gold Coast was on the coast itself were these quite substantial European-built forts made out of materials that were imported from Europe because there was no local stone to which one could make, from which one could make buildings. So all of that had to be imported from Europe. These were often called castles. This is Elmina Castle, the oldest one on the Gold Coast. It's a castle for sure, but really what it is a warehouse for goods, and it's the place where the European merchants lived rather than in the town. And they were fortified, but their fortifications were not directed against Africans or African states. The fortifications were for protection against other European powers, so that all of the different European powers built these types of castles along the coast, and they manned them, and all of the guns were aimed out to sea, not into the interior. And indeed, these castles were built by the Europeans, but they always had to pay rent to the local state, in this case, Ashanti. This is the town around Elmina, the castle in the background, and you see the importance of the boats that are that were used both for fishing and for carrying slaves to the slave ships and to bring commodities from the ships to shore. Along the Gold Coast there are no natural harbors, and so hence ships had to sit out at sea, and then these boats had to go back and forth to the ships. In English, these are often referred to, these boats, as canoes, although you can see that they're actually very substantial, and some of them can hold as many as 40, 50 people. Here's a drawing from 1682 that shows the canoes, the river boats that are going out to the ships that are anchored offshore. Each one of these little river boats had belonged to a local SAFO, or a local organization of adult males who were the crew members and the merchants who operated each one of the little ships. And each ship had its own distinct flag. This one was called Mother of the Town. And just like all the cloth has its own name, each flag had its own name. And then these these organizations of men who operated the canoes and operated these boats had shrines that were related to their specific Asafo, which was related to membership in the group of men that operated the specific boats. And you see here more Asafo flags. Here's a picture of Cape Coast Castle, which was another one of the castles, a drawing from 1704 and how it looks today. Here's another one of the forts. This was Coromantsi, which for a long period of time was one of the most significant ones in terms of the British slave trade. This fort, Coromantsi, and the town around it, gave the name Coromantee, which is often the name that was used to refer to people from the Gold Coast in the Americas. They were not called Akan, they were called Coromantee. And yet another fort, Anamabu, which also was a very important one in terms of the British trade in particular. And here is a representation and shows exactly how many forts there were and where they were located along the coast of Ghana. As you can see here, in many cases, forts were within sight of each other along the coast. I want to draw your attention to certain features of this table, which you can study later yourself in greater detail. First of all, you can see that 84% of all the Africans who left from the Gold Coast, that is the Akan region in the interior, left in the 18th century. So that for this part of the coast, the slave trade is almost entirely an 18th century phenomenon. Second, 64%, that is almost 2/3 of everybody who left from this area went to British territories. So that means heavily to Jamaica, Barbados, North America. And these statistics can be broken down even further, much further. I've done it here by 25-year periods so that you can see, if you look at the far right column, the totals, that it's really in 1700 that the tremendous numbers of people actually left, the 1700 to 1800, that century, where you have more than 200,000 people leaving a decade, which means 20,000 people a year, just so that you get some scale, some idea of the scale of the migration through the slave trade. Before the 18th century, the major export from the Gold Coast was gold. And so it's only in the 18th century that the numbers of Akan in particular are significant in terms of those who went into the slave trade. And this was the period, 1700 to 1800, in which Ashanti emerged as the dominant state, defeated many other Akan states, incorporated them, and in the process resulted in a lot of enslavement of people. One of the individuals who came from there that we know a fair bit about is a man by the name of Venture Smith. And he was taken from one of the forts that I showed you, Coromantee in particular, and he left off the coast of Anamabu, and he was taken initially to Rhode Island, although he spent most of his life in neighboring Connecticut. His name was Venture Smith. His original name was Bukhar, his African name. He was named Venture by the person who bought him on the Gold Coast in 1739, because the money that was used to purchase his was all the money the guy could venture. And so it was his venture capitalism, and he named the boy Venture. And the name Smith comes from the man who actually allowed Venture to buy his own freedom, which he was successful in doing. And he, at the end of his life, he never learned how to read or write, but he dictated what he wanted on his tombstone, which is sacred to the memory of Venture Smith, an African, though the son of a king. He was kidnapped and sold as a slave, but by his industry he acquired money to purchase his freedom, who died in 1805. And finally, I show you here another gold weight and kente cloth to remind you of the artistic and cultural sophistication of this region, uh, uh, which is why Ashanti to this day is recognized as an important part of the country of Ghana.